live.
Hey everybody, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Thank you so much for being with us. You know you're in the right place if you're here for today's webinar, which is how to make your media projects matter more. We're going to be joined in just a couple minutes by Becky Noricks from the Kellogg Foundation, Cynthia Farrar from Purple States, and Fernando Bermeja from MediaCloud. We're going to be talking about today, and hopefully we're meeting your expectations, we're going to be talking about steps that funders and folks who are content creators can take to ensure that their projects, not products, but maybe their products, have as wide a reach and as deep an impact as possible. So you're going to learn the questions you need to ask up front, some tools and strategies to guide your impact, and ways to monitor your reach, and more. And this matters a lot. I mean, we all know that we live in an attention economy, and the number of things that are calling for our attention is expanding, feels like exponentially every single day. I can tell you, and maybe some of you guys are going to be sick of hearing this, years ago when I had a career in television, I worked at CNN and ABC News, and the big challenge for us was we only kind of knew that our work was making a difference through sort of two fairly blunt instruments, right? One was our ratings. How many people turned up to watch what we were doing? And then the other was award season. Did we happen to have our colleagues or peers recognize something that we did? Neither of those is a really great proxy for real impact, seeing the work that you do that really makes a difference. And that's why I think today's webinar is going to be so exciting, because it gets beyond vanity metrics and really helps you ask some key questions, not just at the end, but actually along the way. So I'm really grateful to Becky and Cynthia and Fernando for taking the time to be with us, because I have a feeling at the end of this hour, you're going to be really enriched, and we have a special gift for you. I don't want to steal the surprise, but there's a special gift for you waiting on the other side of this. So now, just before we get underway, a couple quick logistical things to make sure everybody knows what's going on. So first, if you would, scroll down with your cursor or whatever, down to the bottom, you should see a little bar start to hover up, and you'll see on the far right there something that says chat. If you would, take a quick minute and let's just see who's with us today. So go ahead and type in your name, maybe where you're from, your organization. And if you want to, tell us a little bit about how you are, what's brought you to today's webinar. What are you looking to learn? That'd be incredibly helpful to know. So go ahead, and I see Anik, nice to see you. I know we're going to be seeing you in Austin very soon. Jennifer, Claudia, lovely to see you. Molly, hey, how are you? Chelsea, Susan, lots of folks. I'm not going to get a chance to say everybody, but keep going, guys, and you can chat with one another along the way. So if there's questions, or maybe you have a resource you want to share, you can put links in there. Hey, Kaylee, if I'm pronouncing that properly, Safira, Kat, Kate, Aaron, I think I saw Gail and Sandy, Catherine. Okay, I'm going to shut up. You guys keep chatting with one another. So that's the chat box, right? So you can say hi. There's also a Q&A box. That's also down there right next to where you're seeing chat. Hey, Rebecca. In the Q&A box, as you have questions, because we're going to pause along the way and take questions, if you would, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and then if you want, go ahead and take a look from time to time, because you can actually vote. So if there's a question in there that you're thinking, man, I really wish they'd get to that one, because we'll probably have a few, go ahead and vote up, and we'll pick the ones that are most popular, make sure we get to those. We're also going to be taking your questions on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, if you want to keep two browsers open, you're much better millennial than I am, an excerpt. But you can go onto the hashtag ComNetLive, and our friend Yabby is taking good notes for you. So if you want to just settle in and watch the presentation, you're looking for notes, those will be sitting for you at that hashtag ComNetLive, ComNetLive. When we're done, you're also welcome to put your questions in there or offer some comments along the way. And of course, y'all ask us, we're going to do this. We record these webinars. We will post up online on comnetwork.org and on YouTube for free replays. That'll be up in the next couple of days. We're also going to be sharing a PDF with some links for resources that we'll share in the chat box, and you'll also find that on YouTube, so don't worry if we go too fast for you. So thanks again for joining us. Let me go ahead and hand this over to our good friend Becky. Becky, you want to take this away?
Great. Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I see about 69 of you on the line, so that's super exciting that we have such a great audience for this topic. And this is a topic that matters a lot to me. I'm a communications officer here at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And like you, I receive proposals every single day for support for media projects, whether they're film or documentary or whatever they are. And a lot of those proposals come in with a lot of good intention and a lot of excitement around creating the content. Maybe it's the film itself. But some of the pieces that have been missing over my time as a communications officer are thinking critically about what other components of a proposal, like thinking through the distribution strategy and the engagement strategy on the ground, how to get a community engaged around the content you're creating. Sometimes those pieces aren't as thought through a lot in the proposal process. And so I've had that conversation over and over and over again with different grant seekers. And in 2015, I was lucky enough to stumble across the project we're going to talk to you about today, which is this documentary series called Life on Parole. And I met my talented co-speaker, Cynthia, Farrar, in that process. And we walked into this process of creating this documentary, and what I was most intrigued by was that this project, this film project, not only was it a great idea and it aligned to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's grant-making priorities, and that it was going to tell real-life stories of people re-entering society after experiencing incarceration, and then also going deeper and telling stories about the impact of kids and on the kids and the families in their life. That was great, but it did a few other things as well. It brought to the table two really strong media partners in Frontline and the New York Times. You'll hear a little bit more about that later. And an on-the-ground partner to really think about practically how to use the content that was created as part of this film series. But lastly, and this is the thing we'll spend a lot of time talking to you about today, it introduced a tool to me that I didn't know about called MediaCloud. And I know there's several funders on the line that may already be supporting it. I know RWJ, Ford, MacArthur, Open Society, some of you are actively supporting MediaCloud, but I didn't know about it. And what was so exciting was they had thought through in their proposal about using this tool, which really goes beyond social and traditional media monitoring tools, to really help them understand reach and influence. And we learned some things along the way about how this tool could have been beneficial on the front end, the middle, and the afterwards. And Cynthia is going to tell you more about that. I'll just end this by saying to you that when this proposal came in, I was excited not only by the project and all of these things I've described to you, was that I really anticipated we were going to learn a lot from it. And I see this webinar as sort of like a Christmas gift to myself. Like, I saw this gift that I wanted to eventually open so that I could share it with all of you, because we knew there was going to be some good things that would come out. And so we invested in that. We invested in the learning. And so today is the realization of that hope. And I'm hopeful that you'll really gain a lot of benefit from it. So overall, this is going to be our agenda today. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those partnerships I described briefly. We're going to share some of the questions that we learned to ask all along the way, before, during, and after the project, and offer up some tips and best practices, some things that we missed that you can bring to the table as either a funder or a media maker yourself. We'll do a couple different Q&As throughout, but then 5 and 6 on this agenda I think are going to be most relevant to you. If you like what you've heard, we're going to give you a handout that links to all the research that we did to summarize what we learned as a nice takeaway. So it's not really a fancy swag bag that you would get somewhere else, but I like to think that it's just as valuable, and I'm hopeful it'll make you smile. So I'm going to hand it over to Cynthia, who's going to tell you more about this project, and I'll see you a little bit later.
Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here with Becky and all of you. The project that we brought to the Kellogg Foundation with our partner, Downtown Community Television Center, DCTV, was, as she said, we started with a commitment to follow 10 people after they left prison in Connecticut and to see reentry through their eyes. And we secured funding from MacArthur initially as a media grant, and then from Kellogg, and Frontline PBS also brought resources in. We'll give you at the end a link so you can find this material, but as you said, Becky, we are not here to discuss the documentary, but rather what we learned about partnerships and strategies that can work for us in the future, but also for the field, in order to give documentary journalism like what we co-produced, but also other kinds of storytelling greater weight and reach in the public conversation. But I do want to stick with this image and the next one, simply to point out that even the media partnership was unusual, not simply in having two high-profile platforms involved, but because the content that was produced by them was genuinely cross-platform. So we brought them access to these stories, And the stories appeared on both platforms, and so did some of the themes, but in a different context, in a different format, and framed differently. So here you see Rob Sullivan, one of the people we filmed with, in the broadcast by Frontline called Life on Parole. And we saw his life within the framework of the parole system. But we also, on the New York Times, saw this story re-envisioned as a story about childhood trauma, and got to know Rob Sullivan as a traumatized child himself and as a parent. But as Becky said, I mean, where we want to spend most of our time today is thinking about the partnerships that we brought in originally to do a post-production assessment. And we were thrilled that Kellogg was interested in funding the documentary. I was sort of thrilled, I'm not sure about my colleagues, by the fact that we were required to do a serious assessment, evaluation. And what was unusual about Kellogg's commitment to an assessment was that we actually had the resources to spend on it. Kellogg requires that grantees spend 8% of the grant on assessment. And I saw that as an opportunity. We could get beyond what we would otherwise have done, which would have been to gather information from our media partners, which we also did, on reach and engagement, but also to look more deeply at influence on the broader conversation, online and on the ground. So we brought in MediaCloud, and I knew about MediaCloud thanks to Robert Wood Johnson, which works with you, Fernando, and with MediaCloud. So what is it, and how is it helpful in terms of enabling people like us to assess the influence on the online conversation? It's a large database of online news, seriously large, 1 billion stories, more than 50,000 news sources in their database, and a set of tools that enable all of us to search that database, to visualize the results, and to analyze the content in terms of the issue, the language used, the people and places that are mentioned, and to chart those in relation to particular events or a piece of content that we've produced. And to do this, to search this database, which enables us to get past the filtering that we get with search engines. There is no algorithm here. You have access to the database itself. And I wanted to emphasize that this resource is free and entirely open source. We also reached out for this post-production assessment to an issue-specific intermediary, the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, based here in Connecticut, where we were going to be following people, and IMRP, which we're just going to refer to as our intermediary, is an independent research and evaluation group that does public policy analysis on criminal justice and helps the state to develop policy. They're also committed to community engagement. They have very deep roots in communities across the state, and actually help to inform our pre-production process. And in the first instance, on this assessment of the influence of the material we produced, they assembled a range of stakeholders from across the state and asked them about the on-the-ground relevance of these stories and their potential value as a way to anchor the discussions that they saw as most important about policy and practice on criminal justice here in Connecticut. So Becky and I, from the beginning, saw the potential of these resources and our experience to inform what we all do on post-production assessment. And we will come back to these tools as a way to look at that. But it turns out we discovered that actually we could have used these resources in a different way and from the beginning of the project. And Kellogg actually provided a second grant to enable us to take what we had learned and help our partners develop MediaCloud and our intermediary to develop resources that would make these kinds of approaches useful to the field. So we'll begin with questions we can ask and we can all ask and answer. And then we'll move on to some best practices that emerged from the work. I need to say, however, right up front, that we are going to talk about what you and we can all do with these two kinds of resources. We're not going to talk in detail about how they worked or how you can use them in any detail. We will give you links to information that will help you to do precisely that before we bid you farewell. So, the key question that MediaCloud and also to some extent our intermediary would enable all of us to ask up front, would have enabled us to ask if we had thought to use it at that stage, is what's missing from the conversation? Where might the media that you're either producing or investing in, what can it add to the existing conversation on a particular topic? And on themes, for example, we did what all good journalists and producers do, which is we did our pre-production research and work, looking at what kinds of issues, what kind of framing was missing from the conversation. But we could have gotten to parole as a topic more quickly. What we did do, which I think is important and which it's worth thinking about when you're considering a media partnership, is we picked a cross-section of people to follow, and we followed those stories where they led over the course of a year. So those people themselves, the people who are re-entering after being in prison, themselves help to inform our decisions about how to frame this content, and Frontline and the New York Times' decisions. But you can ask this question. You can ask, you can query the MediaCloud database on a particular topic and find out what themes are being explored and by whom in word clouds and other kinds of visualizations. You can look at missing terminology. Is there a particular way of referring to this issue that you think is particularly valuable, and is the online conversation actually doing that? Is there a missing framing in terms of how the issue is being discussed? So, for example, in our case, one of the things that we learned after the fact was that parole is discussed almost exclusively in terms of particular incidents, often high-profile incidents, rather than as we were attempting to understand and convey it, namely through the everyday experiences of the vast majority of people on parole, and connecting that to the policy context. Are there missing voices? Here, our intermediary was very helpful. What voices was it going to be important to include? And if we were going to cover parole, clearly the parole officers and the interaction between the parole officers and the parolees was going to be important. Frontline was there ahead of us, and that was one very notable feature of the production. And then finally, audiences. So MediaCloud has, as I said, a large and diverse source list, and it's possible to look not only in terms of how the issue is being discussed and by whom, but to look for actual sources that might be potential partners. So along the way, it's also possible to query MediaCloud on a particular topic and find out what's being discussed along with, you hope, your content. So you may have an opportunity to turn an obstacle into a chance to frame the conversation differently. So we were hit by a hurricane, really. I mean, this was really a piece of luck, but OJ's parole hearing turned out to be in exactly the same week as the FRONTLINE broadcast and the first New York Times content. So if we'd been tracking, we might have been able to leverage that hugely, hugely significant coverage to redirect the conversation towards people like Von Gresham or the others on parole whose stories were being told by FRONTLINE and the New York Times. And not only to leverage it in the sense of, oh, OJ's on parole or trying to leave prison for parole, and look here, we're covering parole, but more specifically to look at what we learned only after the fact, but you could learn ahead of time about the existing framing of this issue and be very explicit in saying, look, this is high profile coverage of a celebrity. What's the situation that we need to understand about ordinary people who are on parole and about the system that affects what happens to them? This is also an opportunity for your intermediary partner and is an opportunity for ours going forward, which is to understand that they have a chance to connect with media when there's going to be a high profile release in Connecticut, and seek to get the media to reframe in terms of ordinary experiences, data, and the larger systemic questions. And then afterwards, so this is what we did do with MediaCloud and with our intermediary, IMRP, which is to look at the effect that we had or didn't have on the online conversation. So I'm not going to go into great detail here about what this showed about us per se, but MediaCloud was able to show us what happened when our content was published. So we had no impact on the volume, but remember OJ, nor unfortunately did we have an impact on the way that parole is framed in general. That is, we didn't alter the incident-driven focus of the coverage of parole. Where we did have an impact was on the focus on the constellation of issues that affect people's trajectories when they're released from prison, which is captured in a term that's used by the policy community in general for this experience, which is reentry, not recidivism, but reentry. And that word started showing up. And it showed up in relation to specific pieces of content, and key themes that appeared in the content also appeared in the word clouds in relation to reentry and to the broader discussion. And on the ground, we learned through the the screenings that our intermediary did and their conversations with stakeholders, that the kind of access that that we achieved and that was featured in Frontline's documentary, that is, we got into the room with the parole officer and the parolee, that was going to be crucial for the impact of this content and their ability to use it, that the nuance was important. One person said after a screening, that is not the story I expected when I walked in here. I thought there were going to be good guys and bad guys. And that these are everyday stories, and that they featured, which is related to the other 2 points, parole officers, as well as people who were being released. So on to the best practices and a few tips that you and we can all use going forward. The first has to do with the reach we can all achieve across diverse platforms and audiences. We did not make sure that our media partners, New York Times and Frontline, would use the same name for this series or the same hashtag. And that was a problem, not only for the synergies across them, but also for MediaCloud's ability to track those. And then slightly more technical, it turns out that not only our partners, but other media tend not to do in-linking, by which we mean simply that you include an in-text reference to another platform's media story or research or policy content. If you do that, people can follow those links in pursuit of more information or important added details. And this was not happening systematically. And it's important not to assume, and Becky has reinforced this with me, not to assume that your media partners are going to know this. And that whether it's a project developer like us and co-producer, or whether it's a foundation, it's very important to make sure that your media partners are aware that they're hampering their own reach and influence if they're not careful to do all three of these things. Second takeaway from our experience is that this happened with our material, but MediaCloud also tells me that they've perceived the same effect in other contexts, which is that what spurs the most sharing is connecting a personal story to an analysis that has information and that refers to a particular policy intervention. So this is Dave Mason, and the story that the New York Times told was about the fact that Connecticut had begun to provide methadone treatment inside prisons. This was the piece of content from everything else that we produced that got the most sharing on social media. Okay. And thirdly, third best practice is to mobilize an intermediary, an issue-specific one that can be opportunistic. And here, this is something I didn't see it coming. I knew that we wanted our colleagues to help us figure out if we'd produced relevant content. We knew we wanted them to do screening. What I didn't understand fully was that they can make sure that this content resonates and is used in various different contexts and adapted going forward. So for example, IMRP is producing additional content from the footage that relates to their focus on children with incarcerated parents. Instead of producing a brand new curriculum for higher ed, they realized, talking to people in Connecticut, that mostly faculty preferred to incorporate it in existing courses. They were able to pivot when it turned out that the Department of Corrections was not, after all, interested in using this material to inform the training of parole officers. They are able to continue that conversation sort of off stage with their contacts in that sector, and also to recognize and take advantage of the fact that whatever else happens, that coverage by Frontline pulled back the curtain on the relationship between parolees and people on parole.
All right, so we have some time for questions now. There's one in the box from Susan. It's fairly tactical, but let's go ahead and ask it. Susan wants to know, can bit.ly links be tracked through inlinking? So do you have to have a specific, like, full-on link, or can you use these URL shorteners? Fernando, is that a question for you, maybe?
Yeah, I guess that's a question for me, which is pretty technical. The short answer is yes, you can track bit.ly links. Actually, MediaCloud for the longest time had two types of link analysis. One was the inlinks that Cynthia was referring to, which are links that go from one web page to another web page. And we also had a different way of tracking links, which was through bit.ly. We actually had a lot of data from bit.ly. We had a partnership with bit.ly, which allows to see how links were being used on social media for the most part. We don't use the bit.ly data anymore because when we started using it, bit.ly was about 90% of the URL shortening market. So you could tell a lot of things about how things were being used on social media just by looking at bit.ly data. Right now, the market has become so fragmented that the bit.ly data, it allows you to say something, but it's not very representative or not as much as it used to be before. So we still have some of that data, but we don't tend to surface it in our tool anymore.
Can I put you on the spot, Fernando, since we have the pleasure of your company and your expertise? Can you, in maybe just like a minute for folks like me who are maybe a little bit further down or behind the path where Cynthia is, just explain, where did MediaCloud come from? What was the genesis? There was a theory, something missing, and you guys came to fill that gap. So can you just sort of tell me, like, before there was darkness and then there was light? Where did that all come from?
Yeah, absolutely. I can give you the one minute summary of that, which was it all started in a conversation between Yochai Winkler, who's a professor of law at Harvard University, and Ethan Zuckerman, who was then a researcher at Harvard, now a professor at MIT. And they had an argument about whether on the digital realm, it was mainstream media that was still setting the agenda, or whether it was the smaller players like bloggers that were doing so. And instead of ordering another coffee, they just call a developer and say, why don't you build a tool for us so we can do research about this question? And that's the origin of MediaCloud. This was almost a decade ago. It's obviously grown a lot. As Cynthia said, we have over 1 billion stories in our database. We collect a lot of information, and we're increasing the types of data that we have to include social media data and other platforms beyond the open web, because it started at the time that the open web was mostly all that was on the web, but now obviously a decade later things have changed a lot. So we're in constant evolution over time, and right now the project is hosted halfway between the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard and the MIT Center for Civic Media.
And so the follow-up question that jumps to my mind is, was there an answer to Professor Zuckerman's question, or to that argument? What's more influential? Is it mainstream media, or is it the social web, and has that shifted over time?
Yes, it is. There's obviously these issues. There's no definite answer. What we can say is that it depends. So in some occasions, it is a smaller niche, specialized outlets that get to set the agenda, but they often need the big players in mainstream media to consolidate their voice and their issues. So often things start on the fringes, on the margins of the internet, and they need to flow into mainstream media to become actually prominent in the public agenda. That would be the closest thing to a conclusion that we have ever gotten to.
Gotcha. So someone can start a fire, but there maybe needs to be a big media partner to add some accelerant or gasoline on top of it.
That's a perfect way of putting it. Yes.
Okay. Our friend Steven from out of the California Healthcare Foundation has a question, and that is, Cynthia, I think this might be for you, but did some of your lessons learned or best practices come in time for you to make changes to your overall strategy? So were you guys able to, with Becky's help, to make shifts on the fly, or was these lessons learned mostly after the fact? And maybe Becky, you can jump in here too. I'm sure you have an insight.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid to say no. We were not able to do that. We clearly did our job pretty well. So we got to parole on our own, and we got to a couple of issues, in particular, jobs and education that weren't in the we discovered weren't in the mix, and handled the substance abuse issue in a different way that really did add something. But no, what I would really have liked to have known ahead of time is this point about the framing. That is that the coverage of parole is pretty exclusively focused on incidents and high profile ones in particular. Because then I think we could have done, I mean, Frontline did a really great job of kind of really complicating and grounding that question in a different set of experiences. But we could have possibly done more to address that.
And Becky, any reflections there?
Well, I think Cynthia answered it from the project perspective. I think on the funder side of things, traditionally we receive an evaluation report that says, here's how the film did. And then we read it and we say, thank you. And so I think today is sort of an expression of our continued commitment to sort of figuring out how to best work with grant seekers and grantees when we receive proposals for these kind of projects. So I consider myself, or even as I partner with program officers who may hold grants in a media making space, to say, here's some tools and we're going to give them to you so you can be better about your partnership in the proposal development process. So if someone comes to you with an idea of, I want to do a documentary on reentry, you might say to them, hey, have you taken a look, and am I going to also support you, potentially give you some money to work with MediaCloud to make sure that you're really fully aware in your sort of research phase of what you're really entering with this content. So that, for me, that's the funding perspective of it. Of course, it's not midstream in the middle of the project, but that's really the hope and the intent.
Yeah, friend Kat has a question, and that is, Cynthia, I think this is probably mostly for you, which is, how did you get Frontline and the New York Times to partner on this? And more importantly, who, you or they, determined how they would frame each of the stories? So maybe explain first how that partnership came to be, and then how it kind of functioned in real time.
Yeah. So Purple States, which I run, is a production company. And we teamed up with the extraordinary filmmaker, Matthew O'Neill at DCTV, in order to develop this idea of following people after they left prison. And we both had relationships, long-standing relationships with the New York Times, so we went there first. And then Matt had a relationship with Frontline. And I think the reason that they both came on is that we were bringing them very unusual content. I mean, we were following people, just a cross-section of people whose stories are not often told, certainly not longitudinally.
And so I don't mean to interrupt, Cynthia, but just real quickly. So was this, when you went to the Times or to Frontline, were these pre-existing relationships? I'm just trying to kind of map this a little bit for folks who may not be familiar. You didn't just call up the New York Times or like info at New York Times, hey, guess what? I have a wonderful story to tell.
No, we didn't. We had a relationship. We'd built a track record based on work we'd done. But I think it's also true we would not have gotten anywhere if it hadn't been for the character of the content.
Okay. Time for one more question, then we're going to jump back into it. And I promise, guys, we'll get to the other questions a little bit later on. But Claudia asks, these takeaways, these learnings seem to be focused primarily on funded media projects. But how do these learnings translate to in-house media projects, if at all, that are more focused on nonprofit work? So like branding video or fundraising. What might you do to use MediaCloud to help for something that's maybe a little bit more inward generated or inwardly focused, or even just something you're going to build yourself?
So I think that's a really good question. I don't know if I've really ever thought about it in terms of branding or fundraising. I mean, I was thinking, you know, as a funder and as a person who's working inside a foundation where we're more topic or issue focused, I think MediaCloud lends itself really well to sort of campaign work. So if you're mobilizing a messaging campaign with a cohort of grantees around a particular issue, you could really inform the messaging and maybe the shared messaging that you're developing and amplifying. I guess if you're an issue-specific organization that really wants to participate in a space and then demonstrate impact back to funders, you potentially could do that and really tell the story of how you're effective in doing that. So I'm curious, actually, Fernando, if you've come across that question. I definitely see this more as a campaign-based, message framing-based tool, but curious if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and I don't have a very definite answer, but one thing that I can say is that MediaCloud, because of the way it's designed, it actually can serve many different functions, and it's actually very flexible in the way. So, for instance, we've had cases in which someone has come to us and said, we're actually interested in understanding this particular space. So there is people blogging about a particular very specific issue that is not part of mainstream media in any way. And we can actually very easily add sources to our system that we could start tracking what is being said in those spaces. And therefore, you can actually create very kind of niche communicative products that are not necessarily trying to target the whole population or public opinion, but very niche or specific communities. And the same goes for even geography. We have collections which have information about in which state a news source is located and even in which city they're located. So you can actually look at the specific areas of the country and try to get a sense of the conversation about our specific issues in those specific places. So yeah, it's a very flexible tool in many ways. So I think it would be useful for a range of products and campaigns.
And the obvious question for folks who maybe don't have a budget to do something like this, is MediaCloud free to use, or do you need to show up with a few bucks in order to play?
Yeah, no, so MediaCloud from the very beginning, it was conceived as an open source free project, and we've been able to do that because we've had the support of different foundations. As Becky said at the beginning, we've been funded by a number of foundations over the years, which has allowed us to do this kind of work and make it free and open. Obviously, one of the things that happen is that it's like a camera to take pictures. So we give you the camera to take pictures, and that's free. It's included in your cell phone, so you can take as many pictures as you want, and we won't charge you for it. If you want to make a very nice book of pictures for your wedding, then you might want to not only get the camera but also hire a photographer. So that's also a possibility with MediaCloud, in which you can use the tools for free. You just need an email, create an account, and you can run with it and do as many queries and research as you want. Sometimes things get a little complicated in terms of methodology and data, and then you might want to say, hey, I'm willing to put some money on the table to get somebody who is an expert on this to help me do the research. And that's also that's something that we do on a regular basis as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I am mindful of the time, so why don't we jump back into the presentation, and then we promise we will wrap before the top of the hour, but we have a lot to get through, so let's go ahead and jump back.
So that's actually the perfect segue because we were keen, as we said, to make these resources that we saw the utility of useful to the broader field, and it behooved us to find out just how usable and useful they were. So MediaCloud actually spent some time talking with funders and media makers, both people who'd been involved in this project, but also others. And as a result of those discussions, developed a user guide that didn't exist before and is now available on their website, and a worksheet, which is turned out to be very helpful in developing queries to the database and trying to figure out what question it is you want to ask and how best to ask it. MediaCloud also has some case studies up on their website. There is an on the outside Life on Parole case study up. It's unfinished, and Fernando and I will be working together to finish that based on what we've come to understand about the special value of MediaCloud for this kind of project. And lastly, an application section, which is about what kinds of organizations and what kinds of contexts are best benefit the most from using MediaCloud and how. And we will also be contributing to that section. And within our intermediary, we asked them to develop a case study about the role that they played, and that is now available as a kind of on-the-ground guide to what any intermediary of this sort can do to ensure that a media project has the sort of impact on the conversation about policy and practice that it can. And it's available in the 90-page version, but also in an executive summary. They produced, as a result of the screenings that they did throughout Connecticut, a template to help people who want to hold a screening of Life on Parole and on the outside material, but also more generally. It's quite a good generic tool, I think, for people who are interested in doing screenings as part of the distribution plan. And then they decided that they actually wanted to dig a little deeper, and they incorporated what they learned from the screenings into a resource guide, which includes a range of different materials that are keyed to the issues that are covered in Life on Parole on the outside, and can be used by you also as, I think, a template for something you might do or have a partner or an intermediary partner do in your context.
So we also talked to funders and media makers and wanted to sort of summarize some of the feedback we got on these tools and the usability of these tools, and just sort of to whet your appetite for how they might be useful for you. We covered a little bit of this in the Q&A, but we really see the value of these tools, and also especially working with MediaCloud is to help you with a few things. As a funder, most of these are on funder perspective, on the external side, you can really use it with applicants in proposal development, how we're focusing a project, what particular impact you might be able to have. With media grantees around planning your project, knowing what to ask for, maybe some of those questions and the best practices we raise of in-linking in particular. You may have to be a champion for those kind of questions in the seats you sit in. And also just with other grantees around strategic communications, understanding the spaces in which you're communicating. Those can all be valuable externally. On the internal side, and I think this is where strategic communications comes in, really testing your own assumptions about the work you fund and the spaces that you influence. What is really the conversation that's out there? You know, usually you think you may have a handle on it if you're reading the news. You might be surprised, as we were, and we learned from this project. And then identifying those opportunities. Maybe there's a space you haven't uncovered in your communications that you could really delve into. And also, I think working with program officers to say, this is what we're funding, these are the areas, these are the themes we're funding, and let's get a better understanding of that together as we partner as communications folks with programmatic folks. So there's tremendous value, we believe, in the tools, and wanted to highlight some of those for you. So we're going to recap some things before we go into the Q&A, and I think the big headline here for this kind of work is we encourage you to walk in together with media makers and as a funder, or even with partners, assessment partners like MediaCloud. Use these tools and support grantees and grant seekers potentially in using the tools. You know, we gave additional dollars to Downtown Community Television Center and to Purple States to work with MediaCloud because we saw the value on the front end. We saw it from the assessment piece, but then we said, you know, let's develop these tools so the field can learn too. Don't underestimate those multimedia partnerships, but also the role that you can in shaping and connecting the dots between different folks who bring reach and influence, but you might need to elevate their consciousness about what works best when multiple partners are playing in a space. And then don't underestimate that importance of the on-the-ground partner and really bringing things to life and going beyond screening so that work that you do, the content you create, lives longer over time, as in the case of IMRP, and that's the example we gave you today. And so this is the exciting swag bag that I mentioned earlier, but this is a two-sided handout that we're gonna post, I think, in the YouTube link as well as right after. It's two-sided, and so the left side is a part one that's gonna ask you questions that you could use for your own strategic communications. But on part two, it's a sheet you could also offer a grant seeker or grantee to say, what's the potential here for this project? And have you answered these questions? How will you structure your partnerships? What does your distribution strategy look like? Sometimes this is the conversation you have, but it just offers you that comprehensive look, and it's also a tangible thing that you could really work from together in collaboration. And just wanted to mirror back some of the conversations that we had in this work that we did and offer that up to you as a learning. And so lastly, if you're curious about checking out either the project itself, maybe you want to watch the Frontline series or see the 6 different stories, the mini stories that the New York Times put out, check out MediaCloud and the link, or the On the Outside intermediary work. Those are links that we've included in this presentation. And then Cynthia, Fernando, and I are all willing to be resources to you and answer questions that you might have along the way. Fernando is probably going to be your MediaCloud guru. I'm not going to lie about that. But we're here for you, and we absolutely want to answer some questions. I think we've got about 7 minutes or so left. So I'll hand it back to Sean to moderate that. And I'm just so grateful that you've spent this time with us. So thank you.
The first question is going to go to you, and it's from our friend Rebecca Villarreal. So a Becky to a Becky. That resource doc that looks amazing, thank you. So it's not a question, it's more of a statement. Maybe the question there is, you had to create this because you didn't find, I presume that the answer is something like this didn't exist before. What was missing, and how has this been helpful to you as you've been going along? And then thank you, obviously I know others are very grateful for this, but what prompted this?
Yeah, it's entirely possible there's something out there that some brilliant person before us has created. I unfortunately had never run across it, and I just found myself in these conversations over and over and over asking, have you thought about budget for communications to go with your filmmaking? Who are you working with to do community engagement? And I just kept asking those questions over and over. And so this tool, and this is actually really hot off the press. So I am eager to start bringing this into our organization and offering this up not only to communications officers like me who might be associated with projects with program officers, but with program officers. I know a number of foundations have different approaches to how they manage their relationship between strategic communications inside the house with programmatic work. But this is a tool we wanted to give, and I wish I had 5 stories to tell you how it's going, but maybe we can continue that conversation. I plan to use this, and I plan to share this, and I'm just so excited that it's represented in one place.
Yeah, this is just a little bit of shout out to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I know this is in your DNA. When you all learn, you like to share, and it's incredibly.
Yeah, we do.
One thing to flag for everybody, because Simona is asking this question, is where can you get this worksheet? So we're going to make it available. And actually, if you guys go into the chat box, if I take you out of the Q&A box for half a second, you go into the chat box, you will see that we have posted it there. It's a Google Doc. And I think if you just click on that, you're going to go ahead and be able to download it and avail yourself of it. I would ask, just as a matter of courtesy, that you please credit this back to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. But I presume maybe there's a question or two that you think over time might be added there. And I'm sure Becky would be more than happy to build on this over time to crowdsource this. And Becky, you're going to be down at ComNet in Austin in a couple weeks' time. Is that right?
I won't be, but some of my colleagues will. And so I will equip them with this. But I'm always a Zoom call away, and I'm a big fan of the network and the work that you do, Sean, and your team, and so happy to be a resource to anyone who might want to talk.
Okay, thank you very, very much. We have another question. Oh, it's on the phone. Okay, so go ahead and give me the question. Oh, you're going to bring him on. Oh, okay. So I'm going to shut up for a quick second. We're going to do something I haven't done before, which is apparently you can call in with a question. So stand by.
It's just like the Ellen show.
Okay, so we'll try that for the next time. But another question. So Cynthia, from the production side, what are you doing differently now that you've gone through this experience? And I realize the case study that you're writing with Fernando is still in process, but what are some of the kind of key things that you think, wow, I think so much differently now than maybe I did 2-3 years ago?
So just to clarify one thing, the case study that's on the MediaCloud website is very brief. And we're obviously happy to fill in the blanks, but you have a case study from IMRP, and you have these links on the handout to sort of follow back to what we used. I mean, I have a lot of confidence in serious journalists and producers to do their research. But I was very struck both on the content side, the what's missing from the conversation side, by some of the findings. And I think that that will inform how I think about work I do in the future, that there's really no excuse for not asking these questions. You don't have to use the result. You can go with your intuition or your on the ground research if you like. But and then the second one is just the distribution point. I mean, but you know, we're a production company, and it's very rare to find a funder that gets it about the need to fund the process of measuring influence and a distribution process that really engages the community and has the potential to influence the conversation on the ground. So, so I'm very committed to doing that work, but obviously it will depend on finding funding partners. I mean, we'll do as much as we can on our own, but having funding to do that piece of this work is crucial.
And so a clarifying question, and maybe any one of you wants to jump in, Fernando, that feels like this may be most relevant to you, but Cynthia, you and Becky, feel free to jump in. And that is, as I understand it, so MediaCloud has the ability to help you understand how some of the issues that you might be looking to produce content around, produce media around, how they are being framed, what the dominant frames are. I guess the question is sort of leveling up above that. Is there any work within MediaCloud that allows you to see what the dominant narratives are on a particular issue? So there may be a way that we talk about parole, but there may actually be some sort of unconsidered or unconscious thinking that we all sit with that sort of forms the narrative around how we think about the judicial system, the penal system, parole. Are there any tools to help you think about those things as part of this?
Sean, maybe I can jump in quickly and then ask Fernando to give a full answer. But one of the things we heard from funders and media makers who were consulted by MediaCloud about the value of this resource was, look, I'd like to get out beyond my preconceptions, right? I'd like to test my understanding of what's at stake here or what the range of issues is. So, Fernando, how do we do that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can obviously find both what's missing from the conversation, but also what is, you know, the overarching narrative around any issue. And I think that's the beauty of the tool, because it gives you so much data. There's so much information. There's so much content there that you can look at it both ways. And at times, one of the things that, despite all this wonderful technology and visualizations and all these tools that we develop, sometimes the most useful thing that you can do is just run a query on anything that you care about and get a list of URLs, which we will provide you with in our tool, and then just click on them and read the stories. And sometimes just that exercise of looking at what's being said about an issue in the news, not, as Cynthia said, through a search engine, but through a database that is agnostic about your previous searches. It's just giving you what's there. That's often a very healthy exercise to understand what's being discussed, what's missing, what are the assumptions, and what are the overarching narratives around a topic.
Gotcha. We have about a minute left. Becky, any thoughts you want to add in here?
I'll just add that what I appreciate most about MediaCloud when I've experienced it through this project, and I was also part of that funder group that took a look at the user study, just the breadth of the database. So in the seat I sit in, we use Meltwater and we use social monitoring, and you can get a lot of intel from a lot of those tools that a lot of us are probably using. And but MediaCloud is able to look deeper and show all these multiple connections in a more powerful way in one place. And so I think that helps you get at narratives more so, because you're able to, the analysis it's really further along than what you would do just by consuming tracking and some of those more traditional tools that you might be accustomed to.
Gotcha. So I think we're going to leave it there. Maybe as a closing thought to everybody, just a reminder, we are going to be posting this up on YouTube. So if you want to get back to this, you'll be able to see so. We will also be sharing the link to this wonderful resource that Becky has made for everybody. And I guess a closing thought would be something I think maybe a few of you heard me say before, but the days of working in communications for good and believing that there isn't a level of data and science and rigor to the work, the days of being an English major who writes nicely are maybe over. That there are these incredibly rich and important tools we can use to make us so much more precise and effective as a consequence. And this is just one example of them. Deeply grateful to our friends at Kellogg and at Purple States, and of course Fernando and the team at MediaCloud for their time today. I think hopefully we're all a little bit smarter than we were at the start of the hour. And with that, I wish you well. For those of you that we're going to see in Austin in just a few weeks' time, we can't wait to see you. Becky, I'm sorry you're not going to be there, but we will be seeing you from a distance. If you're not able to get to Austin, we are unfortunately sold out, but we will, in the spirit of sharing what we're learning, we are partnering with our friends at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and so we will be sharing every single keynote, including Stacey Abrams and Janet Mock and all the other folks, as well as every in-conversation session that we're hosting. And we're taking notes on every single breakout. So if you're not able to be with us, we will be sharing those notes so that all the learning can go out and do some good along the way. Thanks all very much. We'll be back with you before too long. In fact, I think we're doing a What's Happening at ComNet for those of you who are going to be joining us. We'll be doing that to help you ask questions and make sure you feel really well equipped to maximize your time with us. That's coming in just a couple of weeks, so invite on that to come. Thanks very much. We will see you all very, very soon. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.